Thank you, Stephen. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President in the chair. The minutes of the summer miscellany of Thursday, the 9th of October, 2025 were read and signed. The Honorary Secretary read the names of ordinary fellows who were elected on Thursday, the 16th of October. The following communication was then laid before the Society. West African communities, past and present, seen through Nigerian and British Museum collections by Professor Abubakar Sani Sule. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, the 23rd of October, and then adjourned the meeting. A reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Thank you. We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear a paper from our fellows, James Clark and Emma Slocombe. Professor Clark is Professor of History at the University of Exeter, with research focusing on cultural, intellectual and religious life in late medieval and Reformation England. He published a new history of the dissolution of the monasteries in 2021, Yale University Press, and his study of European monastic culture is to be published by Alan Lane next year. Emma Slocombe is Senior National Curator of Dress and Textiles at the National Trust. She's currently leading a diverse range of projects that explore the manufacture, exchange and repurposing of a broad range of dress and textiles, including medieval church vestments. She is co-author of 100 Things to Wear, Fashion from the National Trust collection, scheduled for publication soon if it hasn't yet appeared. It's out now, excellent. So we welcome James and Emma to present a paper on church vestments in Reformation England, circulation, conservation and recreation.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening, and thank you for the invitation. This is a live research project. It has its origins in research funded by the National Trust. It now incorporates not just ourselves, but the work of a doctoral student who is funded by AHRC. And what we most look forward to this evening is being able to share our findings to date with the collective knowledge in this room. So it's very exciting from our point of view. This is a research inquiry, in fact, that begins in this place. This inquiry into church vestments at the end of the Middle Ages in England and their fortunes and fate through years of Reformation really has its origins in the fellows of this society in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And we're going to begin, and I think we are going to culminate in the work of those pioneers to whom we are profoundly grateful. They set us off on our inquiries, and we are carrying many of their early insights with us on the way. And I'll pass over to Emma.
Examination of surviving church vestments became a fascination for 19th century antiquarians, nested within a broader interest in the material legacy of the material church following the Reformation. The first book to examine the subject in detail was the Reverend Charles Hawthorne's, who published his History of English Medieval Embroidery in 1848. The rich inventories of cathedrals such as Lincoln and Peterborough were well known and a source of inspiration for architects of the Gothic Revival and antiquaries alike, both noticing the paucity of textiles, unlike survivals of glass or masonry, as a source of inspiration. An exception to this was church embroidery, which at its height in the 12th and 13th centuries was known in Western Europe as opus Anglicanum. Hartshorne describes embroideries surviving mutilated in English parish churches as that sad conclusion to over 1,000 years of needlework that was one of the glories of English artistry. Examination of surviving medieval embroideries was also a feature of the 19th century church embroidery movement, and numerous publications were produced on the subject. The same year that Hartshorne published his work, in 1848, Agnes Blucow published plates of designs taken from medieval embroidery for the use of the recreation of medieval embroidery motifs, published by the ecclesiologist, who was critical of the lack of the practical application in Hartshorne's history. And she went on to found the Ladies' Ecclesiastical Embroidery. A later proponent of church embroidery was Mary Barber, and her designs, which you can see here, where she advocated the study of surviving fragments of church embroidery, is shown here.
The antiquarian enthusiasm to investigate what remained of pre-Reformation church vestments was excited undoubtedly by the recovery and, as it were, the re-encounter with one of the finest examples, the Zion Cope, which drew antiquarians literally to the materiality of this English tradition and to the question, what else, like or unlike the fine Zion Cope, might survive, and sent them almost again, literally as a kind of diaspora through provincial England at the end of the 19th century and into the first decades of the 20th century to discover what else might survive.
All of this activity, antiquarian interest and the interest of the church embroiderers and the architects, culminated in the development of a narrative, which we inherit to this day, about what happened to church vestments at the time of the Reformation. And this was summed up by A.F. Kendrick, who was the keeper of textiles at the South Kensington Museum and then to become the V&A, in his publication English Embroidery in 1905. The Reformation practically put an end to ecclesiastical embroidery in England, and the needlewomen thus lost their best patron. The skillful works of former times were, many of them, alienated or destroyed. A large number were taken abroad, and many were left behind only to be burnt for the sake of the precious metals used in the embroidery or mutilated to serve other purposes.
Following Kendrick, to investigate what survived was J. Charles Cox, who was the first really to make a systematic, as best he could, systematic search of surviving whole textiles and fragments of textiles in English parish churches. Cox's investigations were driven by a powerful conviction that there was no moment to lose, that material was almost being destroyed before their very eyes at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. As this quotation indicates in his book, English Church Furniture, which many will be familiar with here, published in 1907, that even in quite recent years, amidst the late 19th century movement to restore and in some cases significantly rebuild English parish churches, material that had been in their possession for many generations was now deemed to be very vulnerable. Cox a real pioneer in this regard, did produce the very first list of what survived, which we've mapped here. Cox identified 42 surviving vestments or portions of vestments across provincial England. To close up on that map, he identified a swathe of England running from the northern end of East Anglia down into the southwest, with a notable concentration in the Severn Valley parish churches, which we will return to. What we've tried to do here in our map is to indicate, with our, of course, charming icons, the distribution of vestment type that Cox found and published in his list in 1907. So altar cloths indicated by the altar image, a relatively small number of priests' vestments that he found surviving in parish churches in whole or in part, and then a very small number of textiles associated with the dressing of a pulpit. Predominantly what he found, or what he thought he was identifying, were altar cloths. This list that Cox produced and published in 1907 then really became the principal point of reference for subsequent generations of research into understanding what was the residual survival of pre-Reformation English church vestments, and the focal point for understanding how to interpret them.
And you can see in the writings of both Hartshorne and Cox a continuation of critical assumptions in relation to that body of textiles. One, the first quote, and separated by over 50 years, the destruction of the greater portion may be assigned to a sacrilegious love of gold, which formed the prominent attraction and consigned them to the Jewish broker and then reduced them to ashes. And then Cox, and many of it found its way to the melting pot for the sake of precious metals. Much more passed into private possession, more than have been recognised are to be found in the treasuries of churches in France, Spain and Italy, where a good deal of imported at the time of the Reformation.
Now, central to the interpretative view emerging from this work, from Hartshorne, from Kendrick, and from Cox, was a growing conviction, even in some ways perversely, as they discovered more fragments surviving in provincial parish churches, a conviction that surviving fragments were poor evidence for how the tradition of vestments in the last years before the Reformation was to be understood. And they argued that instead it was better to refer to visual records, for example, figures represented such as these at Ranworth, that they were a better guide in some way, monumental effigies also, than the fragments themselves. There was a degree of despondency, pessimism, that the fragments that they had recovered, perhaps not so much not a moment too soon, but rather too late, to provide material evidence for the study and interpretation. And again, perhaps that perception has lingered in subsequent generations and coloured the way that the surviving material has been represented.
So to return to our survey, we actually started with Cox's list to begin to engage with this material legacy of the Reformation in parish churches, to understand what survived, to understand whether there were commonalities between survivals, and really to begin to put it into a broader context and to see whether our combined interests, both in material culture, in my case, and James's expertise in the legacy of the Reformation, whether there was something new that we could bring to the analysis of these church textiles, which by and large had been overlooked since the publication of English church furniture. It presented some access challenges. Oh, sorry. Yeah. It presented some access challenges. So A lot of the church textiles are now displayed behind glass, which was obviously a protective measure that was introduced by and large at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. It means that analysis of the actual makeup of the fabric of these textiles is very, very difficult, because church interiors, by their very nature, are both dark and light because of the combination of the architecture and the windows. This is an example from Yatton Church, where the display of the vestment is behind a door. So it's very hard to actually physically access it, and then when you get up close, you can't actually see it. Having said that, though, we were delighted to be able to add another 20 examples to Cox's list of surviving church textiles, so 61 in total, plus 12 fragments. And it began to recalibrate our map, both in terms of the dispersal of the geography of survivals, so away from that conservation, away from the survivals in the south towards survivals that were more geographically dispersed, but also it recalibrated the types of textiles that we were encountering. So we got much more, we discovered many more priest vestments rather than altar frontals.
So in parallel, we have reviewed the archival evidence, which was never the focus for the work of that previous generation of antiquarians. Their research was active and in situ, uncovering fragments in parish churches. So we were keen to understand what written material can still provide, and especially, of course, what new insights that material can provide. Now, it will be familiar to many that there are a number of inventories of the vestments, among other furnishings, still surviving, made at the time of closure of religious houses from 1536 to the spring of 1540. In fact, they present a rather mixed bag of evidence for us in pursuit of vestments and what happens to them. The most important monastic churches' inventories that survive, such as for Zion and for Westminster, of course, have been printed. But the bulk that do tell us something about vestments actually relate to friaries. They have not attracted the same critical attention as the greater abbeys. And they do offer up some really quite significant insights, not least because for whatever reason, the friary inventories tend to capture these textiles in considerable detail. Included at, for example, the friaries dissolved at Stafford, considerable detail on the valuation appraisal that was applied to each and every textile prior to it being offered for sale. The friary inventories are also better in respect of the detail they give as to onward purchases of these items. So we begin to see the process of circulation. Of course, there's a second phase of returns made and inventorizing during the reign of Edward VI. The returns, when in the beginning of the 1550s, parishes are required to retain only a minimum number of textiles. Also, notwithstanding the fact that the vast majority of them were printed at one or other stage in the last 100 years, they bear further attention, not least the extent to which they do indicate that parishes, for as many as they are now holding in the church itself, they are distributing textiles also amongst key officers of the parish. So sometimes those documents are read as records of the dispersal of vestments. In fact, closer attention sometimes indicates they may have moved out of the church, but they have not moved out of the parish itself. Church wardens' accounts and household inventories and wills, of course, capture some of this. Above all, I think it's worth underlining the boxes of augmentations records at National Archives, which as yet have inventories in them that have not been assigned to particular ex-monastic foundations or parishes. So there is more yet to be found. Two of the inventories showing here are in one of those augmentations boxes, unassigned to a particular foundation, but I don't give up hope to coming up with a best guess as for where they belong to.
And like the antiquaries that came before us, we also did look at visual records, and we were particularly interested in surviving church brasses and effigies that related to the period of study that many of the vestments that we find in parish churches came from. So we have two examples here, and I'm having trouble reading the screen and having my glasses on, so forgive me. So John Blodwell, there, the brass from a Cambridgeshire church. You can see the combination of orpheries and high status velvet, that particular coat that he's wearing, and a very late example here in the effigy of Bishop John Vasey, who died in 1554. So a period where you would think that his portrayal in vestments wouldn't have actually been commissioned. Particularly interesting because it retains its original paint, so we get a sense of the colour that's recorded in those inventories.
As we've worked through this surviving material, the first conclusion that we have reached is quite simply that the years immediately prior to and pushing through and beyond the break with Rome in 1534, the Act of Supremacy, were years of intense activity in the renewal and fresh production of textile material, not only in major leading cathedral, monastic churches, but also in many provincial parish churches. The antiquarians in their work rather fixed attention on leading cathedrals and their very well-preserved inventories. So in Cox you find frequently he comes back to Lincoln Cathedral as a sort of exemplum of the level of vestment acquisition that was apparent by, say, 1509 or 1534. The material that we've been sifting shows that, in fact, we perhaps need to widen the field of vision to understand just how intense this is nationwide. It's a period, though, also which sees a greater variety of textiles. We're struck in wills, in church wardens' accounts, and in some parish inventories, just how much of the fixtures and fittings of a parish church by the beginning of the 1530s are now being covered, perhaps in some cases for the first time, with fresh and different forms of textile. The number of new purchases suggests that it's not always the case that a dressing for a statue is being replaced, but it may be being acquired for the first time. The inventories in particular underline some, as it were, modish trends in this period of Henry VIII's reign. The number of imported fabrics that are being purchased for use in textiles, even again in parish churches of not great size and therefore not of particularly outstanding wealth. There are some devotional fashions that are conspicuous in the material that we have sifted, both the surviving fragments and the written records, not least the preoccupation with the Assumption and the number of individual, both clerks, priests, and lay people who, when they decide to invest in a vestment, they specify that it should carry a decoration for use in the Feast of the Assumption. We wanted to give you just some sight of the material of this period. This is now in the collection of the Duke of Norfolk at Arundel Castle, but it only came into that family in the 20th century, previously in private hands, probably dating from around 1500. This is one that we will see shortly, but again, dating from this period. This is from the parish church at Northleach in Gloucestershire, a piece that is made up from surviving copes. This is from East Langdon in Kent, which again we will come to in a moment. These are orphrey figures from orphrey panels, now surviving as detached pieces in the collection at Hardwick Hall. This is from the church at Ling in Norfolk, which we show here because it captures as a composite piece so many of the features of this period, which to some extent we've come to feel is something of a sort of eclipsed period. It's later than the great vestments of that reach a sort of high watermark with the Morton cope, for example. But this is what worshippers in the parishes in the 15-teens, 20s and 30s would have been very familiar with. Again, within that Ling piece, an orphrey figure and a fleur-de-lis design. What's clear is that this was a period of new commissions, expensive and costly fabrics, increasingly a certain standardization in design, orphrey figures following so closely printed styles for the figures of saints that these must come mass-produced from workshops and are being ordered as such from parishes, but also attested in the surviving wills, as in some inventories, the creation of textiles from clothing, from apparel that is being provided for that purpose. And Emma will just point out some features.
So this is actually an Italian cope 100 years earlier than the period that James has just talked us through in the collections at the V&A, because it's very hard within textiles that have already been fragmented and reconstructed to find evidence of the use of apparel in church vestments. This one has been identified by Lisa Monas in her wonderful research on Renaissance velvets as a potential example. And it's worth just looking at the structure of this particular cope. And you can see that actually it's a woven velvet with brocade motifs. That when you think about the coat being worn, great attention is being given to the direction of those motifs so that you get the primary survival of those big panels of velvet at the front and the back of the coat. And then towards the hem, increasingly small pieces of velvet being used in a very economical way to complete the form of the garment. So that's the only comparator that we think we've discovered so far. So if anybody else knows of any, let us know.
Just to exemplify the energetic consumption of textiles in this period, we thought we'd give you one example from many church wardens' accounts. I draw your attention actually to the second bulleted line down, where they are specifying the number of splayed eagles to be shown on the vestment that they are purchasing. It's possible, of course, to work out there clearly was a unit cost for splayed eagles, and 16 of them would come to 13 shillings and 4pence, indeed. This is not particularly unusual in this period, and entries of this kind continue showing us individual parishes purchasing in a very precise and focused and targeted way, certainly into the first half of the 1540s. Now, we've worked through both the surviving pieces and the written records, firstly to try and understand the process by which they are distributed, dispersed. Of course, by the end of the 1530s, dozens and dozens and dozens of churches are being closed and their contents are being sequestered by the Crown. The inventories do underline that as it were, garage sales are being held in some sites for these pieces. And the inventories, when we're lucky, do tell us a fair amount about this. This inventory is quite typical of the level of detail that every inventory provides, specifying the fabric and usually features of the embroidery. So this is a cope with orpheries and with embroidered imagery. Occasionally, particularly again, the inventories from the friaries do tell us a good deal more. They describe armorial bearings on the vestments. Sometimes they also give a full account of the scenes, for example, the Annunciation. They are being appraised by quality of fabric, colour design, heraldry, and condition. As those of you who will be familiar with inventories of this kind, Royal Commissioners are very quick to disparage something as old or worn or greasy, which is another of their favourite descriptions. What's striking is that in most vestries, they don't find old vestments. That casts a question, I think, over the status of certainly some of the larger friaries. Traditionally, we've assumed they've discarded anything that can be sold by the middle of the 1530s in order to continue their life. But it's clear that many of them, in fact, had held on to some of their costlier items. The inventory from the Stafford Franciscans is one of the best, one of the richest, for the detail it provides us in who is coming forward to purchase these vestments. So by the end of the 1530s and into the beginning of the 1540s, the first full phase of dispersal of this material is taking place. High on the list of purchasers are the King's Commissioners themselves. And in fact, correspondence survives between leading commissioners, including Dr. John London, Warden of New College, one of the dissolution commissioners in the 1530s, who is sending out epistles to other commissioners asking, have you yet come across a good vestment? He specifies that he wants one for his own parish church. Patrons of monasteries come back to purchase vestments in quantity. The other striking feature of the inventories is that very few purchasers buy individual items. The vast majority of them buy in very considerable bulk indeed. Undoubtedly stockpiling their, as it were, their future and rising value as textiles. Parishioners occasionally, clergy certainly. The Stafford inventory includes a number of the Franciscans themselves acquiring for money. They are buying them, they're not taking them, but they are buying vestments. But perhaps most striking of all are the names of those who we have been able to identify as members of the textile trade. Drapers in the case of Stafford, who are both local and Stafford-based, and some London-based drapers who've come to buy, again in quantity. Nobody is going away from these sales with just one vestment, perhaps only the friars themselves, but in the vast majority of cases, they are taking them in bulk. Another aspect of dispersal has emerged into focus for us from looking at some of this material. And that is, as I've referred to already, the indication from those returns made in Edward's reign in 1550, 1551 and 1552 that indicate that there is a, as it were, local and more informal process of dispersal of vestments going on at this time. I just draw attention here. More or less every return does make reference to either vestments now being in the hands of another parish officer. They're not actively in use for now in the church, but they are not outside of the parish's possession. And many of them refer to those stolen out of the church by those we know not who. Now, that may indicate straightforward theft. Parish churches in the Middle Ages had always been subject to theft. But it may also be an indicate that individuals who believed themselves to have a claim on these vestments had come back to recover them. So dispersal is not simply loss, as the antiquarians instinctively believed it to be, nor is it only a process of sale, nor is sale simply the dispersal of some raw material of some value. Those buying are tending to buy for a particular purpose, often a purpose connected with religious worship itself. Even the commissioners want them for their parish churches. And there is something going on about local dispersal that deserves more investigation. So what we'd like to do is to take you through some examples of the fortunes of individual vestments that we can trace after this process of dispersal. And we've identified a number of patterns that we think probably are applicable to vestments more broadly across provincial England's parish churches, and vestments that may have a connection with those closed chantry chapels from the 1540s and before them monastic churches of the 1530s. The first point that, again, it seems inescapable to us from the material that we have in front of us is just how much continuity there is. That there are cases of vestments that go nowhere, that stay where they had been, notwithstanding the institutional and statutory changes that take place during the 1530s and 40s, and then Edward's reign, Mary's reign, and beyond. So this is an example from St Mary Magdalene in Bourneton. It's an altar frontal. It always was an altar frontal, and it remains an altar frontal. Bourneton is a church before the dissolution under the patronage of Cirencester Abbey. And it would appear from this really extraordinary rebus, or collision of rebuses, really, that it may have been a gift of not one, but two abbots of Cirencester. We have the rebus in the lower part of the image. There is an ass and a tun. Thomas Aston was abbot of Cirencester from 1488 until he retired in 1504. He's succeeded by John Hackton or Hawkton. And it does seem Thomas is still living when his colleague John succeeds him at Cirencester. And it does seem that this is a combined rebus of a retired but still living in the monastery, Abbot Thomas, and his successor, John, and a gift to a church under their patronage.
In relation to the materiality of these survivals, what I have been using as a model is the excellent research undertaken by Mary Brooks and Sonia O'Connor, which many of you will know was published in the Antiquaries Journal not that long ago, in the assessment of the Auckland altar frontal, the recycling of Archbishop John Morton's cope. Obviously, within our broader survey, we haven't got the opportunity or haven't had the opportunity to date to perhaps look at many examples that aren't under glass, or to assess textiles in a scientific and controlled textile studio environment. So we've taken inspiration from Mary and Sonia when looking at these pieces to assess whether they are whole objects, or whether some of these objects indeed have been recycled on multiple occasions, which we will come to. This particular example is rather cruder embroidery than we would expect from most of the survivals that we've seen. There is a varying scale of embroidery technique that you come across in these textiles. So this looks like it's something with these splayed eagles, something that's been produced locally. And the silk itself has had considerable light damage, even though it's displayed behind a protective curtain for most of the time now. So originally white or cream and red alternating silk on the ground on this piece.
Another example of continuity, a cope, still a cope, always a cope at St Bridget's in Skenfrith, which is then subject to a well-meaning, it's probably the best way of describing it, restoration at the end of the 19th century, now on display, but rather pleasingly for our purposes, with good anecdotal evidence of its continuity of use in that church right up to the turn of the 20th century. Another example of continuity is found at St Michael's Church, Buckland, which is in Gloucestershire. this would appear to be another example of a vestment given to a church under monastic jurisdiction. Buckland was under the jurisdiction of the Cistercian Abbey of Hales in Gloucestershire, not very far from Buckland. And this now composite textile, it has changed its form, but it has not changed its location. It appears always to have been intended for Buckland. In the borders, the red and gold borders above and below the central blue panel, we have a clue to its reason for being in Buckland. It has the word "Y", it then has a monstrance, and then it has a fine embroidered image of a church, an abbey church. Is this perhaps a very late sighting of Hales Abbey itself? This is the rebus of William Whitchurch, or Whitechurch, who was abbot of Hales in the 1470s and clearly presented it to Buckland, a church very close to his abbey and which had always been under Hales's jurisdiction.
And I include this image just so we can deconstruct the evidence that we've got before us. It's made up of 3 vestments, one of which is almost certainly a cope. You can see that from the configuration and the dispersal of the conventional flowers. What's interesting, if you compare the orientation of that dispersal, which tends to be that you have a straight access in the middle of a cope and then the motifs radiate out. The access of this particular object has changed, so it's likely to have lost something from its right side, and that the WYH and the monstrance were probably centrally located in the original textile. I put by comparison the surviving contemporary cope from the vestry at Ely Cathedral, so you can just see where the current section that we've got in this example has been taken from. And you can see that the actually squaring off of the textile of the cope piece, this is a very common alteration you'll see in textiles of this date, just cutting or trimming the corners of the broadest part of the cope and then attaching them to that curved corner to make them rectangular. And here you can see further analysis. These are the embroidered flowers on the 2 remaining vestments that make up the borders of this piece. One, an embroidered conventional flower on red velvet, the other on a kind of voided cream. The motif is unique to this particular example, but repeated over both pieces so that you can see they're actually commissioned at the same time, probably from the same workshop. And this is further analysis of those pieces. So you could see that the figures from what was a crucifix scene with the Virgin Mary and St. John, they actually were cut and then put top to toe along that lower border. And I've just included the Abington Missal, a near contemporary illuminated manuscript with this piece of embroidery, so you can see the configuration as it would have been originally.
So a further example of continuity we found among a surviving example in the Parish Church of St. John in Cirencester, where we have a chantry priest whose brass appears there. His will confirms that he did indeed give a vestment for the commemoration of his obit in the chantry, and his vestment survives, adapted to form what we think is possibly a pulpit cloth.
But I think the jury is still out on this one, given the decorative nature of the surviving pulpit in Cirencester Church. And we haven't had a proper opportunity to think about the measurements of this because it's in a big glass frame on the wall in relation to this pulpit. But certainly the arrangement of the motifs that have been cut from a cope and then arranged in strips is particular to this example. So it could have been used as a cloth at the front of the pulpit with those rows of motifs that would have been viewed by those in the congregation.
In addition to continuity, the material and the documentary evidence does bring us to tracing the movement of vestments. Again, though, the continuity is there in the institutional connections between the later destination of some vestments and their possible place of origin. So we just point out two examples briefly here. This is a vestment that is formed into an altar frontal for the Church of Holy Rood in Wool in Dorset. That church, for more than 20 years after the dissolution of the monasteries, is served by the last abbot of the Cistercian Abbey at Bindon in Dorset, which is very close to the parish of Wool. Wool was under the patronage of Bindon Abbey. That abbot's will includes a good many vestments as he remains incumbent of that church. So it's not an undue stretch to think that this could indeed be the origin of the materials that then are used to form this frontal. Another potential example of this is from East Anglia. This is a cope, an Annunciation cope, very much of the period that we're describing here, at East Langdon Church, quite possibly from West Langdon Abbey, given its very close proximity. Vestments clearly are moving, but they're perhaps in many cases moving within existing and established networks of movement and transmission. They're clearly also changing form, there's no doubt, and the surviving examples that we've been examining help us to understand that. This is an example from St. Petrock's in Exeter, now in the Royal Albert Memorial Museum, where quite clearly, from a cope, we arrive at a coffin pall.
Just for this particular example, I think we've got survivals of two copes, both the cope that has been the foundation of the garment, so this amazing cloth of gold velvet, which is pieced again using some really teeny tiny pieces as well as complete loom widths of fabric recycled here. And then the cruciform created both with cope orpheries and with conventional flowers that have been cut from a vestment, which is likely to be a cope.
Another example of recreation, St. Lawrence's at Priddy in the Mendips, where again a white or cream cope has been reshaped into an altar frontal. That process of recreation, in some examples, is not so much an event as an ongoing process, where the surviving pieces are made, remade, and remade again. And to date, the most striking example that we found of this is from St. Peter's Church in Winchcombe. Again, as an annex to that, St. Peter's Church is scarcely a stone's throw from the precinct of the Benedictine Abbey of Winchcombe, perhaps an origin ultimately for the pieces that went into the cope and orpheries, which then are reformed into a full-sized altar cloth. And you can see in this sepia photograph, it is a very large tablecloth originally, but it has been remade and remade down into something much smaller. It's also passed through a good many phases of restitching to the point that the positioning of the embroidered figures has been altered very significantly. And so in recovering the story of recreation, we are having to pass through very many different chapters to arrive at the form that it now has. Another is at Pockthorpe, where the cope seems to pass through a transformation and then a recovery process, from cope to table carpet and back to cope again. But until it arrives at Norwich Castle Museum, a continuous process. As we come towards our close, we wanted to just underline that one of the emerging perspectives that we have from this research is how much the activity that continues through parish churches, notwithstanding, on the one hand, the closure of many churches, and on the other, the statutory restriction on vestments, rebalances the view from the view originally established by the antiquarians that if there is the recovery and retention of vestments, it's very much a domestic practice focused on nostalgic laity, recusant laity, or elite households. Of course, they're there, such as at Hardwick, but maybe Hardwick is the exception to a rule that is now beginning to emerge from this research.
We are beginning to run out of time, so I won't dwell on this too much. This is one of the amazing noble women hangings that you will know from Hardwick. Hardwick has a history going back to, well, this is from the new hall at Hardwick. Just to show you, that is a detail from the noble women hangings commissioned by Bess of Hardwick for her new hall, hung there and recorded in the inventory of 1601. And you can just see how there is a kind of consistent approach in the cutting of copes to recreate, in this case, domestic furnishings. And you can take those fragments back to surviving contemporary examples that are near comparators, just to show how that process has worked. And again, also within private chapels, this is the chapel at Hardwick again, a cope there with conventional flowers cut to make a pulpit cloth, and then an extraordinary 25 orphreys representing 25 copes stitched together to decorate the altar rail there.
The other element of the antiquarians' established view was not only elite households, but recusant families being the networks principally through which vestments passed. The parish church evidence, perhaps, as I've said, raises a question mark over that. Also, we found that we have to be very careful about the evidence that appears to be presented of recusant survival. This example from Poulton Le Fylde in Lancashire, which is presented even today on display in connection with the effort by recusant families over generations to preserve remnants of pre-Reformation religion. This is now a chasuble made up of at least two late medieval pieces. But in fact, in the Lancaster Diocesan Registry, it's not evidence of recusant survival at all. It's evidence, indeed, of further continuity and retention in a Protestant parish church context. In fact, it came to the Roman Catholic Church only latterly, given up by a 19th century rector, where it had perhaps remained like so many of these other examples. We wanted to end with just underlining that there is almost a return to the antiquarian aspect of the story with which we began. As pieces turn from being repurposed for other uses within a parish church religious context into being items purely of display. And antiquarian contributions then come to the fore again, particularly in the mid-20th century. Such as in presenting this example at Pilton, and then in studying, drawing, painting, and even recreating the example at East Langdon. This, rather remarkably, on your left, is a recreation, a copy, a very fine copy for its time, of the authentic example from East Langdon. So, we would underline that there is no doubt that the antiquarians were right to initiate an inquiry, which we feel we've a century on been able to take a little further forward, and we hope we can continue with this. Consumption of church textiles in the years immediately before, but also during what we know of as the Henrician Reformation, is very striking indeed and deserves further attention. It's clear that there was as much continuity of place and, early on at least, purpose in many of these textiles. They do really set to one side, I think, the hyperbolic claims of great bonfires of textiles for the metals that they contained. There isn't much evidence of that at all, but even of movement through recusant networks. They absolutely were right to have that instinct that in the parish churches there was evidence to be recovered at speed and to be studied by antiquarians such as them. But clearly they were wrong that they'd been forgotten. They hadn't been forgotten at all. And indeed, they were still being repurposed in the 19th century and even into the 20th century. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful picture you've given of us, both physically and through your lecture, of a topic that I was comparatively ignorant of beforehand. So I feel enlightened. And it's really pleasing to see the way that the analysis of context is giving us a new story through this. Open it up to questions, but if I could take sort of Chair's privilege in sort of asking an initial question. I was struck that part of the antiquarian account of this is talking about vestments disappearing to the continent. I wonder whether that's something that you feel was important, or whether your work is suggesting that it's been overstressed in the past.
Our gut feeling, I think I'm right in saying, is that it has been overemphasized. In part, I think it follows from legends of ex-religious scuttling abroad, which have subsequently been shown not to be the case at any rate. Yeah. Of course, there are examples of late medieval English textiles now held on the continent. So they clearly do move. But the evidence of purchases as much by private individuals as those in the textile trade, and as much by those who are keeping them within a worship context, at least until the second or third decade of Elizabeth's reign, suggests that if there is traffic abroad, it's certainly not happening in this first phase. So one of the things that perhaps we need to look at is whether that traffic abroad belongs rather more to the early 17th century, as is so much of Reformation material culture. I think we've probably underestimated how much survives until the mid-17th century and how much movement there is in that period.
So say that there is a change that was, that there is an additional layer of exchange prompted by antiquarian interest and architectural interest in the 19th century that further confuses the picture. So when you're looking at these textiles, there are different cycles and networks of exchange that you need to unpick to get to the truth.
Thank you. Questions and comments from audience?
Thank you very much. It's given me certainly, and I'm sure many of us, a much broader picture than we had before. I suppose not just me, but many of us are really familiar with part of what you've been saying from Duffy's book on Morbath. And the fascinating thing there is there's a great refabrication, if you see what I mean, by the vicar before the Reformation, and then the items, forgetting the rood screen for the moment, the items get redistributed among the trustees. They come back again for Queen Mary's reign, and then rather more haphazardly, they go out again after that. Now, one's impression, and I think I'm quite wrong, my impression was this is a unique survival in the parish records because the vicar lasts so long, right through into Elizabeth's reign. But from my sort of surmise from what you've been saying is there may be many other parish records which are very similar, and I'd be grateful to know, how much you find that to be so.
Well, just to say that the lovely thing about the records at Morbath is that they are complete, and that we are managing fragmentary textiles in the context of a fragmentary archival record. So that complicates it, but it doesn't mean that it's what you've said isn't true. And I think James has found in his research certainly examples of that speak to that.
Yes, I think you're right in your surmise that Morbath is emerging not as an anomaly, but in fact that it is. You're quite right. It's very striking how there's new material coming in just before the beginning of the Reformation there. That's what we're finding elsewhere. So a lot of the textiles that the Edwardian commissioners are picking over and valuing and hoping that most are going to be dispersed, they're not old. They have been acquired. Our impression is they've been acquired over the previous 15, 20 years. That may well be a reason why, as you say, and it becomes clear in the inventories, that trustees, parish officers are not giving these up, nor are they selling them. They are holding them in trust, which must be one of the reasons why then they are still in the ownership of the parish in later decades in Elizabeth's reign and so on. There is more also to be found in bishops' registers of angry bishops at the turn of the 17th century finding that incumbents of churches are completely ignoring the instructions on when to wear a cope and are continuing to wear copes. And that doesn't map to where we traditionally assume there are those not very sympathetic to Reformation. It's dotted around everywhere, which is why our list, when we mapped it, it became clear there isn't a clear alignment to recusant Lancashire or anything of that sort. It's spread around. So yes, I think the more we do this, the more we will find that the most unique thing about Morbath is that the church warden's accounts survived for the whole period and that the incumbent remained in place for the whole period.
Thanks. I was very interested to hear what you said about things being sold to Europe. There has been work on Spain and Portugal in particular, and I wondered if you could comment on that a little more, because the characteristic of the Portuguese material is that it's not cut up, and things abroad are not cut up. So one assumes they're selling them whole, and this process that you're talking about is very, very British or English, if you like.
Well, I have to say that my focus has been on English Parish Church survivals. I think that it's a really good question in terms of contextualising our research. Obviously, at the moment, we are looking at lots and lots of different levels of networks of exchange. So that's probably another chapter for us to look at. So we're mindful that we can see examples of complete copes in European collections, in European museum collections. What we haven't done is started to do the analysis on private collections just yet. But certainly, I mean, there's superb examples in the Rijksmuseum, for example. But some of those were bought through the 19th century antiques trade. So, tracing their provenance and seeing where those copes were before they ended up in that institution is actually very difficult.
It's certainly true that in household inventories and in probate inventories, we find so often references to pieces of copes. So yes, they are being cut up, and some of those households that are showing up at the sales clearly are then taking them and piecing them, as it were. And then in the inventories from Northall, for example, they're already, within a few years of being acquired by William Cavendish, they are already in pieces. And you find those references in other inventories.
Online.
Oh, the only other thing to say was we found only one example of what appears to be a cope made of patched textiles that predates this dispersal in any of the inventories we've looked at. So it's just one example amongst hundreds.
Thank you. We've had a few questions online wondering if you would be able to comment further on other examples of items beyond copes. And there was one question specifically around whether you found any translation of these textiles into ecclesiastical pillows or cushions.
There are some there are references to the making of cushions in numerous both church inventories and domestic inventories. The most famous cushions are the kneelers from Catworth Church in Cambridgeshire, which are now in the British galleries of the V&A, so 14th century examples. They're incredibly rare things to find.
Any more? Can you just wait for the mic to come round, because people online can then hear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I found it very interesting to compare with work that I did myself years ago on English alabaster sculptures, which clearly were sold abroad in very large numbers, and you can sort of map them in France and Spain as having gone up rivers and that way to inland towns. Now, you do have contemporary comments, literary sources that refer to sculptures going abroad, and you also have mentions of sales in churchwardens' accounts. And I suppose the interesting contrast with your textiles is that the churchwardens' accounts may not, I'm not really remembering well here, but may not show the sales of copes and priests' vestments, because of course they weren't the churchwardens to sell. So they would have only come into the parish possession at a later date. And that, I think, is one of the more complicated things to try and sort out. When these things became property of the parish and might then be put in the parish chest, etc. It is obviously a fiendishly difficult area to try and clear things up, but I'm sure that it can be done with mapping, perhaps I was thinking too, of survival of other parish things like stained glass. And it is striking how much imagery of saints survived in stained glass when that might have been thought to be the more objectionable. But thank you very much overall.
Yes, thank you. You're quite right. It does come across in some of those inventories of church goods from the Edwardian period, the complexity as to whose vestments are these, because a number of entries record families coming to recover them, clearly conscious that the Edwardian commissioners are circling and they have come to take them away. Although there's one instance that I've come across where this is then disputed, that the churchwardens are unhappy with the removal of this, which they have been accustomed to use for some time. So yes, for contemporaries, it's vexed as to who has the right to either retain or dispose of these items. And yes, I think you're right in that sense. We're not necessarily going to find definitive evidence of whether they're being sold to be taken abroad or not, that is clearly traceable through all of these records. But I suppose we have to set against that the evidence that they are clearly at times being retained too.
If there are no other questions or comments, can we thank our speakers again for a truly splendid presentation this evening. Thank you. I give notice that the next meeting will be held on Thursday, the 30th of October 2025, when we will hear a paper towards a national collection, Unlocking the Potential of Digital Collections by Rebecca Bailey. Meeting stands adjourned. There is a drink outside if you'd like to join us.